were talking about Keir Starmer there, Mick, and yesterday he was asked about whether or not he would like to see a pay rise for nurses and other public sector workers match inflation, and he couldn't provide an answer to that question. Can you provide an answer to that question?
I can provide an answer to that question. I can provide an answer to Keir Starmer. He's got to ride this wave of solidarity that we're getting. He's got to join into working people's experience, not just their experience of being in dispute, but their everyday experience, and show he recognises that. And the answer is simple. Working class people need a pay rise, and the answer to the cost of living crisis is through the pay packet. It's not through doles that you get from windfall taxes and occasional bailouts to working people. It's the pay packet, permanent increases in people's spending power through wages. And he's got to understand that, and he's got to promise now to fund the public sector properly, to give people a set of employment rights that are meaningful every day in the workplace. He's got to unshackle the unions, and he's got to give us the ability to negotiate freely for the deal that working class people need off corporate Britain and off the government. So he's got to pull his bootstraps up and get on with the job of leading the Labour movement, and not just prevaricating and trying to appeal to the Daily Mail and the Telegraph.
I mean, as someone with progressive politics, I see the likes of yourself, I see the likes of Eddie going out and articulating these arguments, making the case for redistribution of wealth, making the case for a progressive politics. Those are the politics that you have. I find it frustrating. Do you find it frustrating that you are the people sort of being the message carriers for this rather than the Labour front bench?
I found it extremely... I'm not a professional politician, so it's frustrating. The people that are paid to do this job, that working class people put into these positions and the Labour Party put into it, have got to articulate values. So values come first, permanent values that we can stand up for: council housing, properly funded services, public ownership as a principle, not just a convenience or a temporary policy. And then policies follow after you express your values. And what Starmer has got to do is find a way to articulate his values and then turn that into policies which suit the needs of the day. And that will suit the election, and it will suit the mid-term when he gets elected, which hopefully he will, and then it will take him into the next election after that if he can win power more permanently. But if he can't express his values, he's never going to get policies that appeal to people. Values first, then particular policies. And he's got to find a way to do that.
What do you think his values are?
I think his values are to not say anything controversial, it seems. I don't know. I've not heard him articulate values apart from bland tropes, or whatever you want to call them. So it's hard for me to articulate what he stands for. But worse than that, it's hard for people in Rotherham and Barnsley and Glasgow and South Wales and Hackney or wherever else he's appealing to understand what his values are and what he will deliver when he gets into power. And if he's not careful, he'll never get into power, because people will never know what they're going to get from him when he gets there.
Over the course of the morning, you've had large sections of the broadcast media, the print media here, talking to you, listening to your ideas, engaging with you. Are you pleased to see the national media engaging with the RMT and with the strikes in this way?
Well, it's good that that's happening, and it's good that we've got a profile. I'm very conscious, though, that I've got to get a deal. Me and my officers and our reps have got to negotiate a deal. So it's no good having a profile if you don't get a meaningful deal and the dispute doesn't make headway. It's a shame that the Labour Party can't get this kind of coverage when they do a press release. I understand that Keir Starmer did an event in Liverpool the other day, and barely anyone turned up, and certainly there was very, very little applause. So if he can get his profile up through expressing his values and getting a profile in the media, we might have a chance of changing the political and economic scene in this country. So I wish him well in that, but I think if he stands up and identifies himself with change, he's got a chance of doing it.
Yes, folks, the longest in left-directing in history. But I had to include that dig at Keir Starmer not getting any love from the crowd. And we'll talk more about that. David, welcome to the show.
Hey, man, it's beautiful. Welcome, everybody, to America's #1 Mick Lynch fan podcast out there. Always happy to start the show with him, and we're actually going to be dipping into that well a few times tonight, because what he's saying is so clear, and like, he is just one of the best class warriors I think that we have right now, and it's worth celebrating him. But I do appreciate what he says during that clip too, is that like a profile is great, but I got to get the deal,
Yeah.
not getting sort of caught up in the media sphere. But
It's a tough thing because, I mean, especially as like, we continue to just hero worship the guy. He does have that obligation, and it's not to like, own Tories or even Keir Starmer in the press. It's to secure a wage. And I love what he said about the pay packet. There's like, that's advanced, because right now we're starting to hear Democrats like, the Warren types, which I welcome their efforts towards, taxing rich people, but we're starting to hear about windfall taxes and stuff like that. But no, we need permanent gains in people's wages relative to the amount that they're putting in with their labor.
100%. Well, y'all, we have a fun show. Matt's got some promise for me to talk about upcoming recession in just a moment. And then we're going to be joined by Matt Christman. You know him from Chapo Trap House and the excellent podcast, Hell of Presidents. He's going to be joining us to talk about Sleepy Joe, the post-Bernie moment, and some advice to some of the people sort of caught up in the Jordan Peterson universe. It's going to be fun as hell.
We're saving young folks, and particularly young men, with the show by introducing them. And this is it sounds funny to say, but I genuinely also believe this, that for anybody who is like, shit, how do I orientate myself in the history that I've been thrown into? There's a whole bunch of people, from Barry Weiss at the New York Times to Connor Friedersdorf at the Atlantic, that's going to say, go to these absolute charlatan freaks like Jordan Peterson to help figure out where you are in this planet, when you could actually go to somebody like Matt Christman. And along with Chris Wade, they made a really, really great podcast called Hell of Presidents, that I think if people want a healthy way to confront the history, particularly like some of the great men in history, in a way that isn't just like a shame fest, it's there for you folks. And it's not even, it was a Stitcher exclusive, and Christman says at the end of the interview, it is available on YouTube for free, so you're not even priced out of it. That's a true Marxist way of getting into people's minds. So I'm really glad Matt took the time to speak with us.
Yeah, no, very lucky. And towards the end, we're going to be taking a little quick visit to our friends in the UK, talking about the ongoing RMT strike, conversations about general strike, and also taking a little microscope to slimy Starmer and seeing the absolutely despicable and shameful current trajectory of the Labor Party.
It's spineless, slimy Starmer.
Oh, yeah, I like spineless Starmer a little bit better. And then, as always, feel free to join us in the post game at patreon.com/leftreckoning. But I think we got enough intro up. Let's get into this a little bit.
Yeah, so there's an exchange with Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, and I think I'm not actually sure who the guy was. I thought it was Ducey. It's some other person. But they're talking about whether or not we're in a recession, and it gets a little bit, it starts sounding like an English class with what the definition of a recession is. And so here's this clip.
Next week's a very big week for the economy. So I read the CEA blog. Is the White House trying to change the common definition of a recession because next Thursday the GDP numbers coming out are going to show that we've been in a recession?
So let me say this, the strength of our labor market, along with the other economic factors, is what we generally see in a recession, or even is not what we generally see in a recession or even a pre-recession, because we're seeing the strength of the economy and the labor market. So that's really important to note there, because those are key elements as we talk about that, as folks keep asking us about that. So Americans across the country are back to work at a historic level. 21 states, the most in history, have unemployment rates at or below 3%. That is an important number to note. 14 states are now at their lowest unemployment rates since this series began in 1976. And last month, the unemployment rate was a new low in 8 states. So again, the strength of our labor market, along with the economic indicators, is not what we generally see as we talk about recession or even pre-recession.
But the growth of the job, for the 3-month trend, the growth of job growth in the U.S. is shrinking, is decreasing, and 7.5 million people, a growing number, are multi-jobs, meaning they have to work more than one job to afford a living. So is jobs really a good indicator there?
Oh, look, here's
I just want to jump in there and say I seem to recall when Bernie Sanders or even AOC was talking about people working multiple jobs, a lot of people were poo-pooing that as some sort of fantasy, but it's interesting when it gets deployed as the real actual problem and glaring sort of boil on American capitalism.
what I would say. We've always talked about the strength of our economy. We've always talked about how historic it's been, and we've always talked about the transitioning, right? The transitioning to more stable and steady growth. And so to your point about the job growth there, this is what we have been kind of stating for the past several months. Look, you know, the economy created 1.1 million jobs in the second quarter.
All right, so I think that's enough, David. What's your ruling on who's right on the semantic point and what the actual significance of this argument is?
Well, I'm just going to tell you all right now, you know, I think we're going to title the segment something like both the Democrats and the Republicans are lying to you about the coming recession. And the reason for that is like, I mean, come on. We're all seeing indicators. People are feeling the stress and pressure in their lives right now that the state of the U.S. economy is not good. This is not something that is unique to the United States. It is something that's being felt across the globe. But certainly the Biden administration is doing very, very little materially to be supporting people in what looks like, you know, a coming downturn. So like these kind of nitpicking of job stats, and we're going to get later in the segment into a Marxist argument as to why that's actually a very sloppy indicator for looking at the moment that we're at in the business cycle. But why are they doing this? It's because they're worried about midterm messaging. And if we could pull up the kind of right-wing response as well, it's important to note this. Like this is one of those moments in American politics where things become very, very clear that neither of these two, you know, political organizations, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, is very interested in the actual like experience and struggle that American people are facing.
This is what you were talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this guy, Jeffrey A. Tucker, he's longtime libertarian, was on Rand Paul's racist newsletter, those back in the day, which is from like lore from like 8 seasons. Like if we're like Dragon Ball Z right now, that was from like Dragon Ball era politics. Some people follow that, that's out there. But yeah, Jeffrey Tucker says recession next. They'll tell us that it's misinformation, and yeah, so I'm curious. Like Jeremy Horpdahl here says that he's actually lying in this. Says that Jeffrey Tucker wrote an entire essay based on the false claim that the NBER changed definition of recession in 2020 away from 2 quarters of GDP decline to include more measures of the economy such as employment. And he says they have never used the 2 quarters of GDP growth.
Mm-hmm. So like this is the point here is that you're like, and also this is not like an isolated example of a right winger making this argument. I believe Crenshaw's made this argument. Other people have been making this argument. Like all predictions, sir, the Joe Biden administration is going to change the definition of recession so that they don't get in trouble. And again, like this is exactly like, I mean, this is the kind of thing where you realize, not to sound like too much of a crank, like why corporate media is so awful, why so much of the discussions around these issues are so surface level, because the quibble here is about the official designation of what a recession is versus what it's not. So I'll just say right quick that it is correct to say that it's not true that the traditional definition of a recession is 2 contractions simultaneously in GDP. That's not true. But 2 contractions in GDP has happened in every recession. We've seen that, right? There have been recessions where we actually haven't had 2 contractions in GDP subsequently. But yes, typically that is a sign. But the official designation of a recession is done in this country by an organization called the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research. And they make that call using a host of different factors. And I don't even mean to malign the folks there, because a lot of them are very serious economists, smart folks who are doing, you know, detailed analysis of the economy. Their definition, though, is fairly vague, right? Their definition is a significant decline in economic activity that is spread across the economy and lasts for more than a few months. They look at, quote, real personal income minus transfer payments, non-farm payrolls, employment as gauged by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, household survey, real personal consumption expenditures, blah, 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 right? They look at a host of different factors to make this designation. So yes, the White House is finding a way to try to spin this by pointing to the fact that, there is a bit of an anomaly in the labor market, but we'll get to why that might be a bit of a false, signal that the economy is doing well. But I'll also note that, it's not just the Biden administration. Progressive economists like Dean Baker have also been cited in publications like the New York Times on CEPR as, pointing to job growth in the United States as a reason to say that much of this recession talk is early. So that's the conversation that if you turn on CNN, MSNBC, if you read opinion pieces in the New York Times, like that's what the fight is going to be about, which again is so cynical when we're talking about something that is significantly going to affect people's lives. Because look, it doesn't make one bit of difference to you what the NBER calls the moment that we're in. What matters to you is what your wages are like, if you're able to get food at the end of the month, if you have to use debt to finance your living in this country, right? And that paints a very, very stark picture. So I'm just going to put my cards on the table, that I'm not particularly worked up about what the official designation on this kind of thing is going to be. It's true, the liberals are right when they point out that like the right wing people are trying to nitpick and make it seem like some kind of statistical like there's some statistical subterfuge happening from the Biden administration. No, they're wrong. The NBR makes this designation on a whole host of factors, but it's also absolutely incorrect for the Biden administration to sort of be painting this picture like it's rosy. Two just quick things on like the finality of this. Typically, we don't get that kind of designation like going into it. This is something that usually happens after the fact. They say, oh, we've been in a recession for this long, or we've been in a recession for that long, right? So it's not like a bell, like an emergency bell that like Biden needs to press and things start happening. This is a designation that's used for people who are engaged in corporate planning and things like that. And obviously, it's a very, very useful political, messaging tool to say, oh, Joe Biden gave us a recession because of his failed economic policies. And that's why they're worked up about this, because at the end of the day, the Democratic Party is worried about the midterms like they should be because they've done very little for the American people. And the Republicans are trying to find ways to hit them on that. But neither of these organizations or people or groups care at all about the real, struggles that people are going through. And on the Democratic Party side, I just want to note, I don't want to make this all media criticism, but read some of the opinion pieces that have come out in the past few days on these kind of left liberal publications on this. It's all this, rah about some kind of anomalies in the economy, like, the job market, to try and distract people from the reality that they're, feeling and experiencing every day. And it just shows how out of touch that party is with American workers. And that shouldn't be surprising. As Branko Marcetic, who was on the program recently, wrote in Jacobin a little while ago about a survey about membership in the Democratic and the Republican Party, white college educated voters are now making up a larger share of Democratic support than non-white voters for the first time in the survey's 6-year history. This contrasts with the pattern seen over most of the last few decades, in which the GOP tended to preserve its traditional advantage with white college graduates, while Democrats relied on the overwhelming support of non-white voters. So it's not surprising that the Democratic Party, their messaging isn't, bread and butter stuff on this. It's how can we find a way to sort of like hide the alarm bells from our voting bloc, which is insulated from some of the worst effects of what will be coming as we fall into a recession.
Yeah, and I don't trust the Democrats when they're like, "Oh, relax, workers are doing great," is because I think you see that as a problem, right? Like I think, like we talk about the Fed raising rates, they did again today. I think announced another hike, and that's meant to, put more tension into the system and squeeze people.
Absolutely. And like, I mean, this is one of the issues with, even talking about economics, in like a pure scientific way. Cause you noted early on about how like AOC, and I think it was AOC who said this and got in trouble talking about how people are working 2-3 jobs. Right. And everyone was like, well, actually that wouldn't be indicated on, unemployment statistics, which is true. But at the same time, are you really trying to paint over what that reality means for everyday people? Like this
Right.
is the kind of thing where it's like it's a messaging strategy and not a reality strategy for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is why this moment is extremely dangerous. This is why a lot of people start tuning out politics, because they see this debate that like it seems like the stakes are high. We're talking about a recession. Recessions are bad, aren't they? And you see that it's like it's not even surface level. It's like symbolic level kind of stuff.
Right.
But if we could pull up this quote here from Michael Roberts, because I think he lays out a pretty strong argument here about why some of these job statistics may be misleading. And I'm going to read the full quote here, but we have the last bit towards the bottom. This is in a piece. We have a link in the show notes. We're trying to do that more often now on his excellent blog, The Next Recession. Little what is the word? He's ready to go in a lot of different circumstances with that URL. But energy, the recession trigger. Jane Hassius, chief U.S. economist at Goldman Sachs, said there is no doubt that a labor market slowdown is underway, adding that job openings and quits are declining, jobless claims are rising, the ISM employment indices in manufacturing and services have fallen to contractionary levels, and many public traded companies have announced hiring freezes or slowdown. That suggests that unemployment, this is from Michael Roberts, that suggests that unemployment is a lagging indicator in judging when a slump comes. Indeed, that would be in line with the Marxist analysis of slumps. First, profitability declines, particularly in the productive sector, then profits in total. This leads to a fall investment by companies and then in the laying off of labor and a reduction in wages. So the idea here that because, we haven't seen effects in the labor market right away means that we're not falling into a recession is a bit backwards. And I think it's important to sort of re-up that Marxist theory of crisis, where it all starts in this tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And we've been seeing that squeeze. We've been talking about it in this program. We've been talking about it before the pandemic on TMBS, on the show in general, also on GEM. You're seeing in the bond markets, there is a squeeze in profitability across the board. And these things, they move down the line. If we could pull up the next bit, because like, unless you wanted to do something on Meta, like we talked last week about fintech and how they're getting hit very severely in their profits. Today, Meta, formerly Facebook, I almost hate using whatever rebranding that they want to do. They're getting hit very, very hard as well in their profits. But of course, these are like these are the most speculative zombie kind of companies. They're fueled by cheap interest rates and speculation, and they're not as tied to the productive economy. I can't read that book.
I just wanted to mention the Shopify story. It's a really great quote from Mr. Lutke, I believe this Tobias Lutke, the CEO of Shopify. They cut 10% of staff. They placed some sort of bet on, it's tech bros speculating with venture capital. Ultimately, placing this bet was my call to make, and I got this wrong, he said in a memo. As a consequence, we have to say goodbye to some of you today, and I'm deeply sorry for that. So I got this wrong. We have to say goodbye to you. And it's just the way this is going to be a genre that we're going to watch as CEOs start laying off people. The way that they try to make them about them. Like, oh, this is tough for me. I'm so sorry. What adjective can I put in front of sorry? As I say, like, we have to say goodbye to you. And by say goodbye, I mean, David and I have said goodbye and to each other a number of times. None of us left that exchange without an income, right? That's a different kind of goodbye.
Yeah.
And like, it's just this, unbelievable, like, it's going to be dystopian with the way CEOs try to PR spin, throwing people out as the economy contracts.
And of course, so we're starting to see, the shaking going on in the most speculative industries. So obviously, Silicon Valley and all those boys are going to be hit hard. But let's talk about like more productive industry. If you could pull up that last slide, Rio Tinto, and just want to make this clear so nobody misunderstands this. Absolutely evil company, one of the nastiest mining corporations on the global scale, which is saying a lot knowing the history of that kind of that kind of industry. But even they're getting hit hard, and you can't say that people pulling out minerals and raw materials out of the earth is not real productive economic activity, right? Um, Rio Tinto reports a 29% drop in half-year earnings as commodity prices fall. This is from the Financial Times. The industry is now facing a vicious margin squeeze as fears of a demand-sapping recession drive commodity prices lower, while the cost of everything from diesel to explosive soars, right? So when you start to see that, as Michael Roberts lays out earlier, you start to see that in the most productive sectors of the economy. That means that things are looking very, very dire for the future. And remember, this recession is coming out of a few things: supply chain crisis, the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, still the lingering effects of the COVID-19 shutdowns, and inflation, of course. But I want to up this Mick Lynch bit here, because what is going to be asked, and we're going to talk about Fed policy and what this means for everyday people in just a second. What is going to be asked is, it's time to tighten our belts. It's time for you to ask for less raise at work. It's time for you to be a little bit more subservient and a little bit rambunctious, right? It's labor discipline that we're seeing right now. And there's no better example of that than what's happening with the railway workers in the United Kingdom and the strikes in the United Kingdom. And this is Mick Lynch talking about inflation, and something that's always left out of these conversations about what is driving inflation.
I know that you mentioned that, where you said that pay wasn't the biggest part of this. You would come to the pay at the end, but it is a part of it, isn't it?
Yes.
And I mean, look, you would have heard the argument, but I want to put it to you, because there is the argument from government, there is the argument, certainly when it's come to other areas of public sector pay, that you simply cannot put up wages by the rate of inflation, because the rate of inflation is so high, and you end up in an inflationary spiral, which makes it worse for everyone, and we all live with the pain for longer. You just simply can't have 9.4% pay rises.
Why don't you mention profits and dividends in that? I mean, the only analysis we ever get from the media is that it's workers, often who are the lowest paid people in this country, are responsible for inflation. That's patently untrue in this period, because the inflation was there before the pay round, and it's been building all through the austerity and the public sector pay freeze. And there's a private sector pay freeze as well. So real wages have been in decline for many years, a decade probably.
But I mean, it would be a big hike to go up to 9.4% now.
Well, we need the inflation, RPI, the real measure of inflation, which they want to hide, is 11.8.
Right.
And for the 2 years that they're proposing that we go into a pay deal at the moment, it's likely that inflation would be 20% accumulative across those 2 years. Most of our people haven't had a pay rise for 2 or 3 years. If you're a nurse or a doctor or a care worker or a refuse worker, you may not have had a real terms pay rise for a decade. So it can hardly be true that it's wages that are causing inflation. It's profit taking that's causing inflation, because the big corporations are not skimming their profits down and saying, I'll do a redistribution. We actually need to support wages in this economy. And that's what we're faced with. It can't be true that low paid workers are causing inflation. The problem with low paid workers is they haven't got enough money, and it needs to be resolved through the pay pack.
I mean, I think a pretty incredible masterclass there in debunking this kind of argument that it's workers' wages that is driving up inflation, when undoubtedly it's profits. And what you're starting to see now, as I've noted in my piece on Jackman, for example, on the oil industry in Texas, is that what are they doing with most of those profits? They're shoring up their financial position and paying off people in the form of dividends, not investing into production, not investing into wages. And it's because they're hunkering down, for a down period. And that's across that's across all industry right now. So the reason that Mick Lynch bit is important, not only to sort of debunk this kind of false argument that it's workers' wages that have gone up too much in the United Kingdom and in the United States that's causing inflation, is to start to inoculate against what is coming, which is going to be demands that people basically keep their wages where they are as all the prices and the cost of living around them skyrockets. Matt, we had a pretty dark anniversary just 3 days ago, July 24th. which is the anniversary of July 24th, 2009 was the last time there was an increase in the federal minimum wage. I mean, think about how much has changed in the economy since then. Think about how much your cost of living has skyrocketed since 2009. Those workers working those wages have seen no increase despite inflation and despite, severe cost of living increases in the form of rents, etc. Right? And what we're being faced with right now are these demands that we start to accept worse conditions than we already have, which is absolutely inhumane and bullshit. So going back to like the first bit here, it's like the question of a recession. Like, what does that mean for you? Are you a GOP operative who wants to point at the economy, to try to drum up votes in the midterms? Or are you a Democratic Party stooge who wants to act like things are good when they really aren't? Or are you a business trying to plan out your yearly strategy for the rest of 2022, 2023? If you are, welcome to Left Reckoning. I hope we can introduce you to some new ideas. But no, you are a worker. You're somebody who is preparing for what looks like a very difficult period ahead. And how does inflation hit workers? It hits you in the amount of money that you have to pay from your wage, which is very likely has not raised significantly, if it's raised at all, to cover those increase in prices. Nearly 40% of consumers, according to a recent study, cannot put any money at all into savings. And as prices are going up, people are having to rely more and more on debt to survive. 43% of Americans, according to a Lending Tree study that just came out, are expected to add more debt, in the next few months. And what's happening to debt right now, Matt? It's becoming more expensive because the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates. So you're already getting squeezed so that you're unable to, buy the things that you need to get by, things that are the most direct, like food, but even, paying for transportation for yourself. If you have to buy a car and you buy it through debt because you can't afford the amount of money it costs to buy a new or used car, frankly, that's a socially necessary expense that is pushed upon you by society because we don't have public transportation in most of this country. And that means you're going to get squeezed even more. So what happens then? You have to accept worse conditions at work. It allows employers to trim the quote unquote, I hate using this language, but trim the fat, fire people from their work, sending those people into, the Industrial Reserve Army, people who now are unemployed, who now have to compete against all the other unemployed people. And what does that do? It drives wages down. Every policy that we're getting from the government and the system right now is trying to lower your standard of living, lower your wages. And that's why this recession talk, it's certainly important, but you see why they have very, very different priorities in this conversation. The Democratic Party people and the Republican Party people, than you do as an American worker. So your prices are going up, debt is going up, and as a response, investment in jobs is going to go down. And Lord help us all, wage growth, alone is going to slow. And these are the weapons that they use to hit you on your head, to make you weaker and to make you more compliant. And it's why both of these organizations, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, do not have your best interests at heart. And frankly, a lot of people who report on this stuff and talk about this stuff for a living don't either, when they try to use this kind of, nonsensical debates about, oh, well, is this officially a recession under, the NBER definition? Oh, well, they're using the false definition. It's like, yeah, there's correct answers and wrong answers to that question, but it misses the fucking point. And that's why people are so frustrated right now. And we should be looking at folks like Mick Lynch to get us, some kind of pathways and ideas about how to get out of this quagmire than people in the Biden administration.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say the types of conversations that the people from the commanding heights of the economy are really having would go something like, a recession might not be bad because we need bodies to throw at supply chain issues, and we need to get people to work. That's a huge preoccupation for them right now. And yeah,
just I don't want to open up this can of worms right now. I know y'all covered it on Majority Report. I covered it yesterday. Matt, the labor market is so good right now in the United States that there's a case of child labor being used at facilities in Alabama, right? Shut the fuck up, frankly. the shills out there, trying
Yeah.
to talk about how this is a golden moment. But yeah, there'll definitely be more on that. But I think we should get over to this Matt Christman conversation.
We do. I do just want to butt in. We got a super chat here.
Oh, yeah.
So I'll just get to this. Deplorably irresponsible behavior decide who'd win in a fight: a mid-weeping Jordan Peterson with his weapon of choice, or Tim Pool, no beanie to lean on with his samurai sword. I gotta say, I think it's Tim Pool. Peterson is
Ooh.
very frail. Tim Pool skateboards.
I don't know, man. In my life, getting in fights, it's those guys who get really emotional who are the most dangerous. I'm much more worried about a crier than the kind of Tim Pool character.
That is the wild card. Yeah.
We'll be talking a little bit about Peterson with Christman, and then we'll be back to talk a little bit about UK and McLynch. Remember, everybody, we should announce this on the main show. We are moving back for the first time on Left Reckoning to Tuesday nights at 7 Central, starting next week. So this is the last Wednesday show. Thanks to everybody who's been tuning in. Hopefully that still works with your schedule. I think it's going to be a nice reshuffling, and that'll allow us to move the Griscom stream so it's not like the day before, so that we can have a little bit more time to cover more stories. I think it will work out really, really nicely. Join us at patreon.com/Left Reckoning for the post game. We'll be taking voicemails. We'll put up the number at the end of the episode. Next week, I finally did it. I'm sorry, I got delayed again. I had to go through some tax stuff, and Lord in heaven, I came close to becoming a libertarian going through all the tape. But that should be all set up for next week. So hopefully we can get some Left Reckoning merch out to folks who are interested. And more stuff to come in the near future. But let's get to this Christman interview, y'all.
Enjoy it, folks. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, man. How's it going?
It's going very well, and it's a pleasure to be joined now by Matt Christman. Matt is, of course, of Chapo Trap House, and also along with Chris Wade of Hell of Presidents on Stitcher, which came out last year. And it's in that capacity that we wanted to have Matt on as sort of an expert of the presidency. Which is what that show really is. It's not just about the individuals in the presidency, but also what the office means. Bring him on at this point to assess Biden up top. So you do a good job with Chris Wade of talking about when the individual is important versus when the sort of power is on rails. Give us, in that sort of context, your assessment of Joe Biden.
Well, Joe Biden became president because he was the only candidate who stood for a unifying symbol to the center of gravity of the Democratic primary electorate. He represented the party itself. I think what the party grandees imagined after Obama is that, we have the new formula here for how we're going to keep the presidency. We're going to present a new focus group through primaries and through our media apparatus, representatives of new aspirational identity categories on the upwardly mobile, college-educated side of the ledger, the people who can elect you in key swing districts across the swing states and all that. And that the primary was basically them trying out different models. Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg being two of the most prominent ones. Problem was no one was biting. No one cared because the context that had produced Obama had been replaced by this collapse, this falling down the stairs of the last 8 years since then that had just torn people's faith in any of those specific shibboleths. So the only thing that you could get people to agree on, if you were determined that they not agree on, hey, let's try socialism, which was the single presiding prime directive that organized everybody in the Democratic Party, both within its apparatus and the majority of property-owning comfortable voters, were aligned on, and what kept them on the same page. The only thing they could agree on is the party itself, and a nostalgia for the last time they were in power, which meant the person of Joe Biden, the sort of old man mascot of the Obama years, who, of course, Obama and the top Democrats all knew by the time he was in vice presidency was not fit for the office of president. It made every effort to keep away from the presidency. They let the 2000 primary go as long as they did because they wanted someone else to emerge, and it just couldn't happen. So they very reluctantly rallied around him, and he has done exactly what you would imagine a person in that situation would do. They would be presiding lifelessly, because he just represents a dead institution, over the collapse of a political order that cannot be sustained anymore by the will of anybody in its structures. In fact, everyone in its structures now main job is not to promise something that they might imagine for their constituents in the future, but rather to explain why what is happening in the present to their constituents is not their fault. Mm. And that's him. He's the chief explainer. He is the excuse maker and chief. And as a result, he's wildly cartoonishly unpopular and ineffective, and will remain both until something intervenes with this deadlock.
But it's like the thing that's funny about Biden is, like, I like that like term, like the explainer in chief, because like early on Matt and I were calling him like the press release president early on, because like Biden, something would happen and everyone would get really worked up about it, and Biden would put down this press release and be like, I understand how you're feeling about this. This is a very serious issue. And then when it came to what we're going to do about it, very, very little. And like it's Biden is like has been an interesting presidency, I have to say, to see how so many people, like especially like in the media, have reacted to it. And like obviously like mainstream media people are going to be saying one thing or the other, but like early on in Biden's presidency, there was this whole narrative about him that he was going to sort of reluctantly rise to the moment and be this kind of transformative FDR character. And despite like all of these huge moments, like from recovering from
that, by the way,
yeah,
a lot of the people who are very high on their horse about how there needs to be some sort of reckoning for people who supported the Iraq War, how many of those people have some byline where they're talking about the FDR administration that Biden was presiding over, when all he was doing was shepherding the passage of a absolutely necessary bipartisan agreed upon stimulus project that Trump would have passed and would have earlier if Nancy Pelosi had not explicitly prevented him from passing it so that they could beat him in the election.
Yeah.
And that's the grist for their idea that he was going to be a transformative figure, even though he had spent the campaign telling them that he was not transforming shit, that he was going to keep things the way they were, and that he was, if anything, a caretaker who would get change, realistic change, by negotiating with a newly chastened Republican Party. But that was the promise. It was never that there would be any transformation. That was something that people who felt themselves sort of clammily associated with this just disgusting procession felt necessary to tell one another and their audience to exculpate themselves, because they're not immune from that need to let everyone know, including themselves, that it's whatever is happening is not their fault.
But like also like there's so much of that, I think, that like really showed how a lot of like the kind of more squishy progressive left liberal types, like their framework for thinking about politics was like looking at the number, like the line item, like how much is this bill going to cost,
right,
versus like looking at the historical moment of like how radical times we're getting, and the fact that like this right wing Trump was able to put forward, one of the largest stimulus bills in American history.
Right. Like it is that the thing that he presided over, the bill he presided over, was simply just a continuation of a bipartisan approach to the pandemic, which had been throw money at it, most at the top, as little as you can get away with at the bottom. And that was just a continuation of it. There was no additional. If you're having a new administration that is supposed to be allegedly critical of the crisis response of the previous one, and is in office with the assumption that it would offer a new and different approach to the crises that are multiplying, to just then get to call himself FDR, or have these mandarins call him FDR, for putting basically a cap on the end of this crisis moment, and then instead of advancing progressively, asserting the end of any kind of progressive frontier for the rest of his presidency, essentially saying this is it.
Could you contrast for folks some differences between FDR and Biden, both in as an individual, like a little bit, but also like the political structures that sort of led them to the respective tops?
Well, it's interesting. So obviously, their options in office are completely determined by the coalitions that brought them into power. And the coalition that brought FDR into power is this broad expanse of downwardly mobile America, in a country that's never really been able to articulate class politically. You have the real stirrings of coordinated class power expressing itself factionally as the left wing of this popular New Deal front, which meant that the range of options that a president presiding over that coalition that's able to gain this sort of massive legislative majorities that they were able to gain is just orders of magnitude bigger than the options left to a caretaker like Biden after the era of mass politics had been fully foreclosed, after working class articulation in the Democratic Party had completely atrophied, after that class consciousness that can represent itself politically and culturally has been totally atomized, and all workers have been turned fully and finally into consumers. It makes sense. You could not expect the same thing from him, and imagining he could bring you the same thing is a fantasy. But it is interesting that in addition to just having these different bases, you then have these two figures who are so different, right? In terms of intellect, in terms of piercing analysis and theory of politics, they're probably about the same. FDR wasn't a particularly intellectual guy. He famously had an interview with when he was elected with Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. at the Supreme Court, and after the talk, Holmes came out and he said about FDR, he said, second-rate intellect, first-rate temperament. And that was the thing, is that FDR was basically the vibesmith of the New Deal. You had this huge riot of different factions with all these new ideas about what to do about this crisis, because now the zone of the political had been blown open and democratized by the crisis, and there were a bunch of voices to fill that void, and he sort of tacked between them according to what felt right. And obviously, it wasn't what you'd want from a maximalist socialist position, but from the point of view of somebody who wanted to save the American project, yes, save capitalism, but honestly, probably on the wide horizon, on a broad enough horizon, imagining capitalism being eventually overturned, euthanized, as Keynes imagined. And that's because the person of FDR is this incredibly secure, 80 millionth generation Dutch blue blood aristocrat, the closest thing we had to a landed nobility. And with that, the security of that, equal noblesse oblige. Which powered his politics and gave him the ability to do things like say after the business class, his fellow mandarins, his fellow American aristocrats turn against him. He's able to make a speech where he says, "I welcome their hatred." Because he had this other base of support in the broad American context. He's this fancy boy who was he probably wore a velveteen culottes until he was in his teens. And you had billboards in West Virginia for coal miners to read that said, "Your boss knows," or I'm sorry, the president knows that your boss is a son of a bitch. And and that meant something. Now, Biden, similar mind probably in terms of, policy and all that, but a completely different social milieu. He comes from that striving middle class that emerges after World War II, but the precarious lower rung of it. His dad lucked out. His dad was, from the working class, immigrant Catholic milieu, makes it towards the middle by marrying into families that have more generational wealth, but then backs the wrong horse, ends up having to sell cars in Delaware. And his son growing up in this environment that is defined in distinction to FDR by precarity, but not by capitalist exploitation, not by the experience of a father on the line, or a father working with others in a union capacity, but the striving, lonely, hustling experience, the same one actually that Richard Nixon emerged from. And that background then powers him into this distinctly uncomfortable, grasping, cringing attitude towards the rulers of this country, a instinctive deference with the hope that they would basically let him in the service entrance, which they have. but only at the price of him never deviating from within very narrow parameters. And so, of course, that turmoil of the turmoil of the 30s throws up a figure like FDR, and this moment of just decline and specifically degradation of institutional legitimacy is going to bring up this shallow, empty, literally senile ward healer who has only ever known slapping backs and doing handshakes at VFW halls, who has never understood politics as anything other than a transaction, is going to now try to make a deal to achieve his apotheosis, which is being defeated in a presidential election. Like, you look at some presidents and you're like, wow, this guy's destined to be president. FDR was destined only to be president in order for him to lose the presidency, because he's probably the most inveterate loser among our presidents to date.
And one last thing on Biden, before David jumps in, what significance do you think it has? Because if I was a paid up Democrat shill and I had to say nice things about Biden every day, the thing I would emphasize is, well, look, National Labor Relations Board decisions are slightly better, and of course those are significant to the workers who benefit from the decisions. But what sort of, like, we're in the midst of a really impotent administration. What sort of vestigial significance do you think that sort of relationship has?
Well, you mean like the NLRB, or?
Yeah, because I think ultimately we all agree here, or at least I know David does, that it'd be nice to leave the Democratic Party behind like a chrysalis and have a Labor Party. The
Right.
Democrats still have have that labor on their corner. I'm just curious how you think that plays out.
Well, the thing is that organized labor, as it's currently considered, is absolutely hostage to the Democrats. It's not going anywhere. It can't go anywhere, just as the Democrats can't choose any other way to be. Like, that's why, I mean, I know it's rich for someone who kind of got prominent by screaming at Democrats, but what I've really come to metabolize in the last couple of years is yes, they're all demonic creatures. They're evil in their function and in their own personal desires. They see the world through a monstrous funhouse mirror, but they are also disposable. They are replaceable. They are fuses. They're spark plugs. And getting mad at them is like getting mad at those elements of the machine, because if they did act differently, they would not get to the positions they are. They started acting differently. Once in those positions, they would be replaced. So the union bureaucrats are stuck in the same institutional relationship that Democrats, that people within the party are. So that is why a lot of people have a hard time imagining, a third party, because if it's going to be based in labor, how can you see that occurring when the organized labor is unable to extricate itself from the Democrats at an institutional level? And I think the answer there, the good news and bad news, is that any of these intractable problems that you see is going to be resolved by the continuation and the furtherance of crisis, and the deepening of crisis. And that, yes, that deepening of crisis is going to be dangerous and is going to be painful, but it is also the only context where new possibilities for political action will emerge. And I feel like that is why fundamentally a negative, depressed attitude towards the moment we're in, that is fixated on imagining a break as an apocalypse, as a cataclysm, as the end, is really just an inability to imagine any kind of life with meaning outside of the very bare synthetic forms of self-soothing that we have access to in our current otherwise unsatisfactory lives. If we have faith that life continues past our specific homeostatic relationship to our environment, then everything opens up. The problem with that, though, is that it very much limits how much anybody in the social media or broader media sphere can talk about tactics and strategies and things to do and practices, because anything we're going to be able to agree to a vocabulary about is going to be beyond our actual day-to-day actions to change. We will not be able to influence by any specific individual act. Now, we can pretend that by doing something and imagining everybody else doing it at the same time and for the same reasons because they were exposed to the same arguments, the same media that we were, you can imagine that, and many do, but it doesn't actually happen. Everybody is just going at it alone. Everybody is winging this right now. And the more that you are forced to fill in, the action items with abstractions, the further your actions are going to be from meaningful impact, and the more there's just going to be dissipate into symbolic expression. Yeah, I mean, it's weird. It's a liminal space that we're all kind of floating in.
Well,
And it
I
might
mean, I
last the
wanted
rest
to.
of our lives. That's the funny thing.
I mean, that's the scary thing, and and the scariest thing is it's looking very likely like it's going to get worse as the Democratic Party continues their stranglehold on the ballot. Like here in Texas, watching South Texas Tejanos and Hispanics and Mexican immigrants, vote for Trump and Republicans is extremely frightening. And what's even more frustrating though is when you talk to Democrats who sort of oh, well, those people are, they're just confused, or they have bad faith, or they're not real Hispanics or something like that. And it's well, no, y'all have never shown up for any of these people. You've continue to run these extremely conservative right-wing people in South Texas under the name of the Democratic Party. It's not that surprising that sooner or later people might say, well, you know what, I might go with the real deal, that at least is going to be in power and might be able to impact some things. But I was hoping to go in a little bit of a different direction. I wanted to talk a little bit about the post Bernie moment, which you were sort of touching on there. And as somebody who was talking to a lot of people during the early Bernie years and then the 4 years that were basically the dress rehearsal for the 2020 campaign, I'm curious what your thoughts are about the moment now. And I just sort of wanted to throw one thing in, about thinking about political power, because it's something I say a lot on this show. But how Bernie, his slogan was always not me, us, right? And everyone was like, oh, this is so nice. Bernie's thinking about us. He's including us. I think that he was quite literally making the correct analysis, is that the presidency of the United States is extremely powerful. But let's say somehow I'm able to overcome this, hostile Democratic Party and become the president. I'm going to need pretty significant social movements and organization to be able to do any of these kind of things. And look, I don't think that it was wrong for us to go as hard as we did for Bernie. I think that was the right move. It opened up a lot of space. But I don't think that people really reckoned with that reality. And what I'm trying to tell people now is that in the absence of that kind of avatar to be, our presidential candidate and rally behind that, we need to actually start really thinking about how we could be there in the future if we have an opportunity like that, so that when a Bernie Sanders kind of character might be saying, not me, us, we actually have the us to implement some of the things that we're arguing for.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about how if Bernie had somehow won the presidency in 2020, we would not be in a situation now where, oh, we fixed COVID and there's universal health care. It would not be the meme with the spaceships and everything. We would have all the crisis we have now. They'd be just as bad, if not worse. Bernie might be less popular than Brandon, for all we know, in approval polls. But the people who voted for him through the lens of a movement, as opposed to those who voted for him because he's a brand that they're engaging with, otherwise known as the people who would actually have to provide ballast and direction for a social movement, not the whole group of voters. Those are the ones who give you access to points of power, but the harder core. It would have given right now, those hardcore people would have something to do. We would all have marching orders. And that would have, I think, even with things as objectively bad as they are, the same level of badness in some objective sense, the subjective experience of living in this country would be vastly different. The hopelessness would be replaced by at least somewhere to put those feelings. Even if things are bad, even if things in your own personal life get worse, there's a place to put those feelings that's productive and that feeds into a positive loop of cooperation with others, towards egalitarian political goals, as opposed to the situation we have now, where everyone is paralyzed in the face of the lack of any alternative to this bourgeois mental breakdown that we're just getting to watch from the outside as the Democrats and the Republicans go against one another. And yeah, the Bernie campaign was an attempt to reverse engineer a social movement from the top down, which people pointed out, you can't really do it that way. And I think the reason that Bernie was worth supporting is that argument doesn't take account for the fact that the other route is foreclosed. But at the moment, there's no organic processes that are going to spring up social movements the way that they did in the 30s. We live in this hyper-mediated consumer age where the presidency is like the axle around which our political identities revolve. And so someone being able to act from a position of power rather than just like being in the Senate and then watching on TV and reacting to it the way we're forced to when a Democrat or a Republican is in charge, would have, kick-started a process. And yeah, we didn't get that. So now crisis is just accumulating, and there's just this passive and increasingly politicized, but politicized around reactionary axis, working class, a focus on grassroots activity, like defining yourself politically not through consumption or through ideology, but through actual concrete action in your life is the only thing that's going to give you the ability, if conditions throw one up, which they very well might, because anyone who says they know what's going to happen is just telling themselves a story to keep them where they are. Anything that's thrown up, you can engage with, as opposed to, which I think is what is going to happen if there isn't some breaking away from this orgone relationship with spectacular politics, that the moment is missed because what's happening right in front of you, you can decide for X, Y, or Z abstract reason doesn't meet the criteria of being something worth your time because it doesn't adhere to a checklist of things that are essentially meaningless to the question in front of you and to the people in front of you, but which do have great currency in the speculative, spectacular realm where you craft a fine ideological weapon that is too brittle to actually engage in contact with the enemy.
And like, I mean, I totally agree with that last bit too. And I mean, because I do see that, like, we're going to have to sort of be reacting and hopefully building up movements that can sort of deal with this ongoing collapse. But like, I do just sort of want folks to sort of learn some of like the weird habits and the bad habits. I think like the larger Bernie movement sort of inherited from like the fact that we were like in campaign mode for like 4.5 years. And that was when a lot of people became politicized. Where like, I don't know, like you get this a lot where people, especially people who watch these programs and, consume a lot of political media, they think that like the reason Bernie Sanders didn't win was because independent media wasn't strong enough and corporate media is too common, right? Which is like,
or he went too woke or any of this bullshit.
Yeah.
It's like the people you needed to drown out the voice of the propertied Democratic electorate who have no material interest in seeing a Bernie Sanders presidency, who you cannot convince out of that because it's deeper than ideology. It's actual material interest shining through, which you are pushing against in every context because it's organized around a property regime that demands the total sacrosanct nature of private property, won't accept and cannot assimilate socialism. To drown that out, you needed people who don't vote in Democratic primaries. And those people, by and large, were not paying attention because they had made the rational decision to stop caring about that stuff, if they ever did, because of the manifest evidence in their life that caring about it, that voting, that investing in it doesn't matter. It doesn't bring a return. And restoring that faith in the political is going to come not from the top down and not from rhetoric and not from memes and not from the ether. It's going to come from people rediscovering the efficacy of collective action in their lives and being like, oh, this is politics. And this actually is something that can make my actual life better. Instead of just provide me with a ideological architecture that makes me a good person and everybody else bad.
No, I mean, like, I want to get to Jordan Peterson in just a second, but like,
boy,
I'm looking forward to that. But there's just one point I'd just like to get your opinions on. Like, I talked to some of my friends here in Texas in the union movement, and like, obviously, like the fight for the Green New Deal or some kind of policy like that is critical. But I was talking to one of my friends here who's an organizer in the IEW about like just transition, and like, I love just transition as a policy. And he does too, and a lot of people within the AFL-CIO unions do as well. But he said something that I found to be really on point. Ryan Pollock is his name. Was that that sounds nice, but like nobody believes you.
No, nothing has ever been taken away and then replaced with something better.
Yeah,
it's never happened in anyone's lived experience of American politics.
So if you want
nothing that promises, oh yeah, we're going to take this thing that you depend on away, but don't worry, we got you. There's no reason that anyone should believe that. It doesn't make them a fascist for not believing you. It doesn't make them a death worshiper to not believe you. When you say that, because these people on the left who have a climate agenda are forced to piggyback on a political party that has no legitimacy.
Yeah.
And they cannot infuse it with their desire for it to be so.
And like
because they have been shown repeatedly, specifically over the last 2 years, how seriously the Democrats will defend their positions of power.
And like the point is not that we should drop like those commitments or like ideas, in my opinion. It's rather that like you should be showing up for people right now. Like, there have been like capital has been like a huge war in Texas and across the country. It's not unique here, but like with oil and gas workers for like the past 3 years, like during the pandemic, they fired a bunch of those guys, right? Now all their unions are getting pushed and squeezed out. And it's just like, why not focus on like building up movements that are showing up for them, coordinating with those guys there, so that when you say these things like we're going to build a just transition, you at least have like some kind of common language or history with each other. So it's not just the weird guys showing up at your plant telling you we're going to, protect you for the rest of your life, Yeah.
No, there has to be a buy-in. And that is something that is the biggest handicap to the project of rebranding the Democrats basically in a way that can make them credible messengers for this, is that the people that want to do that cannot point to any wins. They can, and they'll never be able to point to any wins. They can only point to a theoretical horizon where if enough of them are in charge, they'll be able to do X, Y, or Z. Meanwhile, the only thing that does ever get done is the punishment part of the package of reward and punishment that goes into any political project.
Yeah. Well, on that note, let's move on. I want to get some guidance for the young men who are alienated from history.
Yes, please, let's do
from Matt Christman here, because Jordan Peterson's been doing a bunch of messages to different folks. He did messages to the CEOs, messages to Muslims. This is from his message to the Christian churches, and he has a premise here about the moral weight of history that I want Matt to respond to as somebody who is passionate about history.
We're young men. That is not a phenomenon that can be easily accounted for, but let me try. Now in the West, because of the weight of historical guilt that is upon us, a variant of the sense of original sin, in a very real sense, and because of a very real attempt by those possessed by what might be described as unhelpful ideas to weaponize that guilt, our young people face a demoralization that is perhaps unparalleled. This is particularly true of young men, although anything that devastates young men will eventually do the same to young women. And that, in this era of antinatalism and equally reprehensible nihilism, is precisely the point.
Okay, that's probably enough of that. How did you and Chris avoid sort of falling into despair as you produced Hell of Presidents?
I mean, because we went with a materialist analysis, and that is what's lacking from all historical narratives, including his goofy bullshit. Because if you look at, there are people doing history, and they all are moral agents, and they all contain good and evil in different portions, and their lives are shaped by the decisions they make. But once they depart the historical stage, we're only left with the artifacts that they then imparted on us that we now have to make our world out of. And when looking back, the moral lens is absolutely useless to use. Determining good and bad people is useless. They're gone. They cannot do anything. And when you look structurally, you see just how little actual agency exists in these structures. For the vast majority of time, people are really carrying out roles that transcend their individual will. There are those moments of of febrility, those hinge points that throw up possibilities, but those are punctuations of an equilibrium of stasis and sort of enslavement in a real sense for everyone, but of course not equally for everyone, and that's where the moral part comes in, and that is, but the moral question of like where history has brought us is what to do now, and reason that like liberal anti-racist history does have this effect of alienating white men and making them feel this guilt is that if we don't have a political moment, right, and we don't have political action, a plausible path to political action that is in alliance with any idea of justice, restorative, making things better for people broadly, if that's off the table, which we all understand, and subconsciously at least is the case, then all of those morally urgent questions of accumulated past injustice can't be addressed easily. We can't do it. What we can do, though, is assign blame. But of course, all the people responsible are gone. All we have left are their descendants, and therefore we can pick them. We can divide them by group and say who's most responsible for why things are so bad. We can spend the remaining political energy we do have, the ability to punish, the only thing we have, to make them pay for what has happened. And of course, the state's not actually doing that, but that is the fantasy of punishment that is conjured in the minds of a white guy who hears this history of their crimes. And it creates this idiot argument between a group that wants to build a fantasy narrative of morality where they're extricated from it, because yes, it's either POCs who feel I'm aggrieved by this system completely and therefore not responsible for it, even if I'm relatively privileged in its hierarchies otherwise, or white people who get to expunge their sense of guilt by acknowledging it in some trite way that doesn't do anything about their actual accumulated wealth, that doesn't take away their granted countertops. And the alternative, which says we're going to either deny the historical record or go through the looking glass and claim that that legacy of violence and exploitation and domination and slavery is a positive good that should we should model our society over now. And we're left trapped with those two options of violence and retribution and domination because the working class has departed the historical stage.
And it's really infantilized everyone's understanding of history because, like you said, before people go through the looking glass, that you just have the mythologized version of George Washington never told a lie and that sort of stuff, as opposed to, I would say, if people are really looking for a balanced view of history, Hell of Presidents is a great show because you go through the actual certain salutary parts of say a president's ideology, but also an understanding of what the structure was that they were at the helm of. Right. And that's omitted when Jordan Peterson acts like it's just, Robin DiAngelo is the only one writing history books. We're kept that sort of, I'm just so pissed the way people like Connor Friedersdorf of The Atlantic talk about Jordan Peterson as somebody we should send alienated young men to. It's we should send them, frankly, to Chapo and Hell of Presidents.
I'm not going to say it, but you did. I've heard people say, people I respect say, what's the real harm with Peterson if people just clean the room? And honestly, if they do, that's not bad. You should have just listened when your mom told you, but whatever, as long as it happens at some point. The problem with Peterson is that there is this actual salutary intro of, get your own life together. And a lot of people who find the world oppressive and undealable realize, if I actually pay attention to the things in my control, I can kind of build outward a capacity that then can give me confidence and rob me of some of that sense of paralysis. But it's limited by our conditions, and conditions are not going to change. That's what we all acknowledge. So there has to be a second part. And the second part for Peterson is, okay, so you've cleaned your room and things still suck. Why? And then he has this narrative, which is just a mirror image of the liberal hysteric narrative of villains and heroes, of individuals, of ill intent, warping our institutions towards evil. And that means you're not going to keep tidying your room and then moving outward and dealing with the frustrations and the thwartings of life in alienated capitalism. Instead, you have an open invitation to return to the fantasy realm and make a world where, I can distract myself from these intractable problems by trying to win the war of ideas online, by trying to be a knight errant against cultural Marxism. And that means you're right back in the dirty room. And like, you look at this, the cycle of Peterson's public persona shows this. It's these, he cannot stabilize a relationship to his audience or himself because he cannot deal with the real frustrations of life without retreat to fantasy. And that is what the political dialogue, the dialectic between the two halves of the schizophrenic middle class psyche is a retreat to fantasy.
Yeah.
I just before we let you go, I did just want to bring up one of my favorite moments from Hell of Presidents, which was y'all were talking about the campaign of William Henry Harrison, Tyler, what is it? Tippecanoe and Tyler too,
yes,
and how they went across the country.
Log cabin and hard cider campaign.
I love that image so much. It made me frankly proud to be an American, in the sense that, like, we've always just been this extremely sentimental nation that even in 1840, we were just, so devastated about like the end of the American way and our frontier spirit, even just so close to the revolution. We already had this kind of feeling that, the true America has been lost.
Of an encroached upon ideal. And of course, the very funny thing is that in that election, William Henry Harrison was the representative of the Whig Party, which was generally the party of Eastern finance and the merchant classes in the American cities, as well as land speculators in the Western states like Kentucky and Ohio and stuff. And the Democratic Party was the party of the yeoman farmer and the urban mechanic. It wasn't a working class party, because the working class had not come into coherence yet, but it was the common party. This new concept of a common man that was only possible in the context of American dispossession and slavery. Couldn't do it in Europe with its society of orders. It's still structured land relationships, and that's the most important thing. But they were the party of the common man and the small farmer. But because the president at that time was, one, presiding over an economic crisis that the doctrine of the Democratic Party could not contend with, and it was also a fat, round little gentleman, a little lawyer from New York who wore scented doilies and had fat little hands, named Martin Van Buren, who was considered this decadent fancy lad. And then William Henry Harrison, who had been territorial governor of Indiana, and who was a Virginia gentleman, but was play acting as a log cabin rustic. And so you have the party of merchants and finance doing this pantomime of common man imagery, which persists throughout American history from that point. They also would have giant balls of twine that they would roll in their processions behind the model of the log cabin that they would be dragging by a donkey on a truck.
Man.
And then, of course, the hard cider. And it actually started because a Democratic paper had impugned Harrison as a rustic and said the man, send the man back to his hard cider. And the Whig press picked that up and said, yes, he is the candidate of hard cider and log cabins, and then got to campaign on a cultural grievance. It's really nothing. Those structures have been basically unaltered ever since.
Yeah. 19th century culture was wild. The first corporation I'm aware of from my hometown, Mandan, North Dakota, was the Sitting Bull's Log Cabin Company, which picked up Sitting Bull's Log Cabin after he was arrested and took it on tour. So
on that grind. That's right.
Exactly.
God bless him.
Matt Christman of Chapo Trapos and of Hell of Presidents. I can't recommend both those enough. You probably listen to Chapo, but check out Hell of Presidents. Very, very excellent show. Thank you so much for joining us today, Matt.
Thank you very much. If you don't want to go to String, whatever, I think they're on YouTube. Look them up.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, nice of him. I wasn't, sorry to cut you off, but I wasn't quite sure what he was saying at the end there with the just get it on YouTube. But that's very nice of him.
Yeah, I guess so. No, I would just say I'd pay money to see that log cabin in action. They noted in the show, but apparently they had live raccoons in it too.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, to make it more. Oh my god, man. Yeah, come on, time travel. If Zuckerberg figures out time travel, where I can go back and witness that in a semi-real way, I'll take back everything I said about capitalism. That's the line, because I need to see that. People being just enthralled by a guy like sitting on a rocking chair on a fucking mobile log cabin that they just load onto the back of a train.
That'd be a sight to see for sure, friend. All right, y'all. Here's what we're gonna do. In a second, we're gonna talk a little bit about the UK, but just right quick. After that, we'll be going to the post game where Matt and I will be hanging out, taking your questions and comments from the show. You can leave us a message at 1940-289-7234. And you get access to that at patreon.com/leftreckoning. Really looking forward to hearing if anyone has any comments about that Christman conversation, which was, I don't know, pretty nutritious. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I like it. I see some people making like comments about nihilism. I don't get that from Christman.
I don't get that at all from Matt. I think that's absolutely incorrect.
Frankly. I think there's a certain maybe like want of hope. But I think, he basically said like collective action is the politics, and maybe something will happen that, drives people towards that. And I think his take on Bernie is also right. Like it would have been horrible what they did to Bernie, honestly. I think if he got elected somehow, elected president, and so like I think those things are all good to keep in mind. But
and like the point is not to say that don't try to do things. It's recognizing that.
No, that's my point.
Yeah,
stop.
No, it's like that was going to be really difficult, and we weren't ready for that. Frankly,
right.
I think it would have been really beneficial. And like the point now is like, okay, so we can do thought experiments about what could have happened and what all that. It's fine. Do analysis. Yeah. That's good. But the point now is to start setting us up so that we're not in that position again. I don't know. I don't find that to be necessarily nihilistic.
And I think like the thing he says about like, it would have been a good opportunity to like exercise certain muscles is extremely important, because frankly, like we don't have the social democratic muscles anymore. But like the fascists, like they don't have, like fascists have got free reign sort of in America in a way, but it's not like Franco, right? Like where they're literally like have the colonial army come back and reinstitute, like they have to exercise their own sorts of muscles, and they're not guaranteed to have a kind of a long-standing victory or right? So like this stuff in general, I think that we're seeing, especially with with the spontaneous collective action we are seeing with workers in different parts of the economy, is there's it's hard to emphasize it. Like I know why Christman comes out the way he does, but like it's I don't think nihilism is a fair assessment.
Well, let's talk about something. I mean, that's also dark, but inspiring at the same time. In the United Kingdom, there have been these prolonged strikes. Another action happened today with the RMT, which is fighting against really severe austerity. Effectively pay cuts because they're not reaching they're not matching inflation in the economy. And just a couple things just to like catch everybody up before we go to some of these clips. So there were more actions today. Only 1 in 5 trains were running around half of the network. Some lines closed completely. And this is quoting from The Guardian, and more strikes are planned for Saturday and next month. The Transport Secretary, Tory Grant Shapps, threatened to ban strikes by different unions in the same workplace within a set period and ensure critical industries such as rail maintained minimum service levels. So this is not just one random call from the Tory party. We're seeing it from many, many folks, including people who are very likely to potentially take on leadership of the party from Boris Johnson. So what's going on right now is there's this prolonged labor struggle And the government itself is now threatening to make one of the basic rights of a democracy, the right to engage in strike action when you are not being heard by your employer. They're trying to find ways to effectively make that illegal. So things are dialing up there in this fight. And I think it's really important to, note some of the conditions there. So those are the actions from today. But this is another piece in The Guardian, sort of in response, some of the response that we're seeing to these calls. So this is in The Guardian today. Unions issue threat of United Kingdom general strike as rail crisis grows. And this is from today. Unions warned that the United Kingdom could face a general strike this year as rail workers voted for fresh action set to intensify as summer of industrial unrest. The vote for further transport strikes came as Keir Starmer, we got some words for him in a second, sacked Shadow Transport Minister Sam Terry, who conducted a broadcast interview alongside striking RMT workers at the Euston station, a move that is likely to increase divisions between labor and trade unions. Just an incredible sentence right there. Move that is likely to increase divisions between the Labour Party and trade unions. Other shadow ministers are expected to escape serious sanction, but Terry was told by labor whips he had broken collective responsibility by making statements about pay and inflation that are not party policy. We're talking about this more in depth in a second, but just absolute carcass joke of a fucking party, the Labour Party under Keir Starmer right now. As much of Britain's rail network ground to a halt, the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union chief, Mick Lynch, called for a general strike in retaliation to ministers' threats to curb industrial action, warning of the biggest resistance mounted by the entire trade union movement. Travel was disrupted for millions on Wednesday as some lines closed. Only about 1 in 5 trains ran on about half the network, as a fourth day of pickets this summer affected the networks in England, Scotland, and Wales. So this is only, getting much more serious. And that call from Mick Lynch is a serious one. And I think we've been seeing, this kind of percolating for a while of other unions sort of showing support and solidarity with the RMT. Many people starting to show up and support, just lay people, everyday citizens, for this action, despite the onslaught from not only the Tory party, but also the Labour Party against this very, very justified and correct action that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I mean no offense to folks who call for a general strike, on Twitter in regards to something. I think it is the correct, people are identifying the correct cure. What I will say though is that coming from labor leaders that's when you're starting to cook. And because I remember going back to like Occupy, it's like, oh, we need a general strike. It's like, okay, how do we, who could possibly start that up? Is it just going to be different people that get on at that point, like Democracy Now! Or MSNBC? Like, no, it's going to have to come from, labor leaders.
Yeah, and like I'm sorry, it's like the same thing as saying like we need a revolution. It's like, fine, it's just like that's not moving the ball forward in any kind of material way. This kind of work is what moves the ball forward. Like, everybody knows the tactics, right? Strike action, protest, etc. Like, that's not a mystery to anybody. It's like the ability and the capacity to do it, and they've been building that up. And I mean, we'll get to a few different things in the segment, but I want to say to our friends in the United States, well, I'm talking like I'm a foreigner, to other Americans, like, this is like the kind of playbook that you should be looking at. Like, what happens with the Labour Party? The Labour Party betrays working people in the United Kingdom. They won the coup against Corbyn, but also the significant refusal of that party to recognize the hurt and the calls from people in that society, particularly in the industrial sectors of the United Kingdom economy. When labor unions, for example, were saying we need to get away from institutions that are against our interests, like the European Union, you saw the Labour Party make a very, very similar gambit. Like the Democratic Party did in the United States, was they said, you know what, we're going to say fuck you to all of the working people, and we're going to instead turn to more comfortable cosmopolitan folks in London. And that's the kind of nonsense that you saw with the demands to nullify a democratic vote in that country and called for a second referendum, which was not the only thing that tanked Corbyn, but that was an undermining policy from the Labour Party to Corbyn that basically made the Labour Party appear very, very clearly to folks to be an organization that was extremely hostile to the interests of labor and workers and their voices. And that only becomes embodied in its purest form by slimy, or what do you call him, spineless Starmer in the United Kingdom. I think before we get to Starmer, though, I did want to focus on some of the hits from some of the media hits from Lynch. We played Lynch earlier in the show talking about inflation and how it's amazing how they always talk about wages and they never talk about profits. But this is another clip here of Eddie Dempsey, who's another spokesman for the RMT. And I just want people to watch this because it is in the same way that Mick Lynch is so great and clear when he goes on these spots. This is a really incredible example of going on into hostile territory and just hitting your notes, because they try to trap him on 3 or 4 different things throughout this clip. And every single one, he responds immediately and sort of, knocks down their kind of straw man arguments in their attempts to try to derail this conversation.
You wanted a pay rise. You've got that. The pay rise you've been offered.
Got a pay rise. It's a real terms pay cut.
Offered is more than what nurses are getting. It's more than 3%.
Nurses deserve far more than what they're getting.
So just wanted to note right there, that's absolutely perfect, right? Trying to derail it because they've been doing this time and time again, is saying well, let's find another group in society that you should care about, and you should care about the state of affairs for workers in the United Kingdom, as you should in any society. And they're trying to say, what if we pit the railway workers against the nurses? And we make it a choice between, do you like nurses more? Do you like railway workers more? And he says, absolutely not. We stand in solidarity with nurses and they deserve more, right? It just this is the kind of tactics that they use in the media to try to distract and create false lines of division amongst the working class. And this is a great example of somebody just refusing to play ball with that shit.
Bonuses worth hundreds of pounds.
No,
not good enough.
They have to cut 400 million out of their operational expenditure, thanks to Grant Shapps. So they're slashing 1/3 of the entire maintenance frontline workforce. They're cutting maintenance schedules in half. This is the infrastructure you'll be travelling on. That's what they're doing to slash money out. And they want us to accept that. And if we do that, as a reward, they're going to offer us a real terms pay cut. That is not acceptable. If workers' wages are not keeping up with inflation, they are going to be made poorer. That is not a pay rise. That is a pay cut. We're not going to have it.
Workers' pay rises cannot keep up with inflation if you're not to have a wage price spiral. Well, you know that. It's got to be below inflation.
That's absolute rubbish. What's caused inflation is the shock of the supply chains from the global health emergency and rampant profits. 73% profits are up since 2019. Pay at the top is going through the roof.
Nobody's arguing that. What I'm
no
saying
one's worried about pay at the top, Anne.
You cannot match inflation with pay. I've just explained, because then you get into the wage price spiral. Then you get into the wage price
But people at the top are all right. Their profits can carry on going through the roof. For 30 years in this country, wages have not kept up with inflation. At the same time, profits have rarely not exceeded inflation.
You tell me.
There has been a transfer of wealth from working class people to people at the top, and that can't carry on. That has got to change.
I mean, that's rubbish, I think, is the correct response to that kind of argument. And look, there's no answer. There's no answer to the question about profits and those at the top, because that's what this whole conversation is designed to obscure, right? They try to make it seem abstract, oh, well, that's just something that happens. That's a natural process, not something that is planned. And the fact that the Tory party and the Labour Party, frankly, are so aligned against the interest of trade unionists here, I think also really exposes a fundamental reality of the nature of the capitalist state, which is that they are set up to protect the long-term interests of capital, right? At the end of the day, is a wage increase for those railway workers the death knell of capitalist production, or of capitalist power in society? No. Why are they fighting so hard against it? Because they know that if the railway workers get a wage increase at the expense of profits at the top, then that will come into other industries. And they want to make it seem like it's a hard law of economics that you cannot have living wages for workers and have have functional systems, which is an absolute lie. And it's a testament to how successful this movement has been, that they are able to go on time and time again and shut down these tired, limping arguments that are allowed to parade themselves for so long as detached scientific analysis.
I mean, that was exceptional. I don't know what more to say about that. Like, and like you said, they only have that one response, which is like, this will necessarily, if you give people raises, it'll necessarily lead to inflation. And they literally don't have anything to say to like, okay, we're just going to let like rich people continue to get massively, massively richer and buy up like anything like productive and useful in society as people get immiserated. And that's what they're there to. That's their function in media, is to protect that. And it is like what's that? Is it John Carpenter with the glasses? It's like all of a sudden somebody's saying the thing that like the subtext, and you just hope that it's we can get it out there enough, I guess.
So as we said earlier in the program, the Labor Party has been in turmoil, not just in terms of polling and their weakness and their limpness as a party, but also because Keir Starmer has told, we talked about this on the program earlier, like a few episodes ago when we first started covering this, he has told members of the Labor Party that they cannot take a firm position in support of trade unionists in one of the largest industrial actions that we've seen in our lifetime. Right, which just shows how dead that party and that organization is. And today, as we noted earlier, they fired the shadow transportation secretary Grant Shapps for showing support to the RMT. So that's the current state of play for the Labor Party. But you know the difference here, and this is like the point, other than us just trying to show solidarity and cover this, the difference here between what's happening in the United Kingdom right now and is what is happening with the U.S. left is there is the correct analysis on both sides, right? The major kind of nominally left party, the party that people assume stands up for workers, even though the history of both of those parties shows that it really hasn't, is betraying us. So in the U.S., we criticize them, rightfully so. In the United Kingdom, you have seen this upsurge in trade unionists saying, we're no longer going to support the bottom line of the Labor Party. We're not donating money. We're not showing up for them. They don't show up for us. And we're seeing it through the RMT. We also saw it with Unite the Union when they elected Sharon Graham, who has been taking an exceptionally powerful stance against the Labor Party, saying, if y'all don't stand up for workers, why should workers show up for you? But instead of just sort of sitting back and saying, we're not participating in like society or in politics in like the grander sense, they've taken it much more directly and said, we're going to fight with each other and we're going to build up a strong working class movement in the society that has gotten to such a point where you have Mick Lynch making credible threats of a general strike in the United Kingdom because of the mismanagement and the threats that are coming from the Tory party. I just bring this up because, sometimes when we talk about the problems with the Democratic Party, I remember this like very vividly, especially when I first started working on TMBS. People were like, well, yeah, it's fine. You don't want to support them. Well, of course, we'll go to protest with you, right? Which is a very flat view of what political action is, right? It's either voting for those guys or, showing up at a protest and you take a picture and you go home. No, there are ways to engage in politics that have material benefits and express material threats to those in power that is separate from just saying we're going to create, a voting bloc, etc. I think there's a use for voting and participating in democracy on that level, but this is the example when we talk about working class politics, is recognizing that this false sphere of politics that is taught to us in this country, and particularly like through liberalism, like big liberalism as like a political philosophy, where it's every couple of years you show up and you pick a name and that's like you participating in democracy. No, the Marxist socialist argument says politics touches all of these facets of our lives, most importantly the workforce, where they say that it is not part of politics. And this is an example of bringing politics into the daily lives of the membership of those unions, into the general public here, and actually building up real strong independent working class power that I think is a very useful example for us to be learning from. Now, there are different contexts here. A lot of the unions in the United Kingdom have traditionally been more radical than American unions, right? We are in a period of retreat in this country. So it's not a model that we can just import, sloppily one for one. But when you're trying to imagine and conceptualize what that looks like, this is an example of something stirring that we should not only be supporting, but saying, how can we learn from some of these movements here to be getting better results for working people? Because the fact is that, again, in the same way that the Bernie Sanders movement was so worthwhile and beneficial, the Corbyn movement was as well, right? I think that was an incredible use of people's time. It came really close, to maybe being successful, arguably maybe even closer than the Bernie Sanders movement ever did. But in the absence of that kind of vehicle, and in the reality of seeing how just decrepit the Labor Party was, how strong that organization, like the Labor Party can't do shit, but they can take the whip away from Jeremy Corbyn, right? They can
and salt the earth. Yeah.
What?
And salt the earth for like anybody trying to run that program again.
100%. But like, and what a lot of people have when they face that kind of defeat is, oh, we're going to depoliticize. I'm just going to try to live my life. What we're seeing here is people saying, we're going to take the shit into our own hands. And like, that is the kind of model, because maybe I'm rambling, but like the point that I'm trying to get here is that like, people sometimes have a flat view of politics, that like the only way to engage in politics is inter-party struggles and then maybe at the ballot box, every couple of years. Right. And this is an example of how that avenue is always open. It's open enough that these guys don't have elected national positions, right? In the sense of like they're elected officials of government. These are elected officials within their union, within the working class as a whole, who are going up and saying, we're going to flex our muscle, and they have to listen to us. Right. Now, what they're trying to do right now is negative, right? What the Tories are trying to do is outlaw strikes, frankly. Right. But they're having to play ball. That's an engagement. That's political conflict. And those are the kind of terms in the arena that you got to be thinking about if you're serious about changing this thing, because hoping that the Democratic Party one day is going to wake up and start fighting for people is a pipe dream at this point. Finding interventions that are beneficial is worthwhile, but also recognizing that there are also other avenues that can be very successful is also absolutely crucial. And I think a lot of Americans need to learn that quickly.
And like you said, like it doesn't say that like voting is pointless. It's just like that really voting is to widen the berth, or to make a more hospitable political environment for if all of a sudden we get an American McLynch, right? Like if we start talking about that stuff here, it's right. The politicians, like you're franchised. If you can make it that day, you should do it. And particularly if you got somebody on DSA or an independent socialist running, you should go help those out, or even a progressive, whatever, right? Or, if you got all Democrats, like I voted for just absolute trash in North Dakota, just against like John Hoeven and shit. Right. But like that's not the game. It's not. That's like the refs for the game. Right. And you can try to get, and that's it's a way that can lead to a little bit less disappointment, I think, and a little bit more understanding of what's going to be the prime motive force if we do see progress.
If you have those 2 bits I sent you in the chat handy, like I do want to take a quick.
So here's the Liverpool one first.
Yeah, let's do this. And remember, for people who've been watching the whole episode, at the very beginning, we played that Mick Lynch bit to open up the show. And he was talking about how Starmer had a visit to Liverpool where barely anybody showed up. We'll break down some of the things that he said there, but this is an interaction that he had, I think, following or maybe right before his visit here. And yeah, if we could pull up the caption. Oh, the captions is fine. If you don't worry about it. The caption of this, whoever shared it had a good caption. It says "Scow's Queen destroys Starmer," which I just I love as an editorial. But yeah, let's play this for a second, because this is what this guy is facing, and I think it's good that people are bringing it to his face.
Can I just say that I don't know how you've got the guts to come to this city after you have been being interviewed and doing a column with the Sun newspaper, after the way we as a city were abused, and after the way we as a city, the Hillsborough victims were abused by that paper, and you've come here. Secondly, you lied to us about uniting the party. I'm still a Labour Party member. and you've expelled and witch hunted in the most vicious way I've ever seen in my lifetime. And I've been a member of the Labour Party for a long, long time. You have absolutely said you had 10 pledges, you were going to carry on the Corbyn legacy. And ever since, you've done nothing but distance yourself from the ideas which tens of thousands of people joined the Labour Party to support. And all you've done is feed into the Tory ideology of not supporting strikes, of carrying on with the privatisation of our health service. You're doing everything to feed into a Tory victory. Because we may as well have a Tory if we have a person like you who lies to the party. It's dishonesty.
Thank you very much.
And our health service is going right
much.
down the pan. And you have a big responsibility, the working class people of this country.
Can you move back, please?
Excuse me. You're just, don't be getting physical
No,
with
I'm
me.
not touching you. Can you move back then, please?
You're touching my breast.
Can you move back, please?
Now move back.
No, can you move
I want
back,
to go
please?
to the toilet.
Toilet's over that way.
Absolute queen there, and like that's how Keir Starmer should be treated every time he goes out in public.
Yes.
And what you said there was right. Is like, you know, I know it might sound, you know, a little bit hyperbole, but what she said is like, you know, I'd rather have a Tory in office than somebody like you. And the fact is if you look at what Keir Starmer has done since he's taken over leadership of the Labour Party, he has done nothing except try to make it very clear to capital that the Labour Party is very serious about protecting their interests, and has been a very, very happy junior member of the Tory government. And they are connected deeply at this point. You don't need to look much further than how they have been basically refusing to stand in support with this extremely popular working class movement, demanding dignity at fucking work, something that the Labour Party was founded to deliver political voice for people to do.
I mean, they're corrupt individuals, right? Like, and the Labour Party seems lousy with them now, and that is my impression, that they have. There was such this energy, like what was it, 4 or 5 years ago, and all it's been since is witch hunting people out of the party. And I don't. And the smears of Jeremy Corbyn for being anti-Semitic, like, I mean,
just lies at the end of the day.
And we're still in this, like, apparently in this, like, glacial, like, frozen in time moment where we don't act like we all know that's what happened, and don't know that's the only reason Keir Starmer's there. Like, what else is he there for but to just foreclose that?
Well, he's there to inspire the people. And if we have this, this is so he was in Liverpool to deliver a keynote speech on the economy, which, you know, at the end of the day, other than a couple of flourishes, is indecipherable. And in actual, like, material level is frankly indistinguishable from maybe, like, you know, a more moderate wing of the Tory party. But I need Matt. Matt spent some time in the United Kingdom, so maybe he can help me understand these terms. Okay. Because I'm at a loss to understand what these 5 principles of a Labour government would be.
Okay, so I'll read these. Starmer sets out 5 economic principles of a Labour government. Interesting. Okay, I can't wait to dig in. First, financially responsible. Well, I'm already out.
We all know what that is. I'll bring austerity with a nicer face than the Tories will.
Oh my God. Yeah, that doesn't mean all of these fat cats who have been soaking up all your productivity for the last 20 years. We're going to take that back and spread through society. No, distinctively British. Honestly, like, I'm a very big fan of British culture, from Peter Cook up to, like, I mean, Spice Girls are fine. But I don't know what that means. I don't know, even, like, I can't even Rorschach it, what that could possibly mean.
Colonialist, maybe.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Distinctively British economic principles. What are you, like, gunboat diplomacy? Like, good luck, guys. I mean, take back the Suez Canal.
So there's nothing clear except for this third one, which I think is a very telling reality about the Labour Party.
Right. They're going to re-energize communities.
And also, for people listening, the third one is partnership with business.
Oh yeah, partnership with business. That's exciting.
And re-energize communities. I mean, actually, out of all these, that's something that he has done, because as you saw from that Liverpool woman just a second ago to the RMT strikes, they have certainly re-energized communities.
And then invest to boost productivity. I honestly, this makes me want to faint. How insane this is! This is his principles. Well, this is the home of the English language, and this flies. This is what the state of the art in politics is. Invest to boost productivity. I mean, it's like I'm talking to an IBM robot or something.
100%. So there's no answers there, no answers at all from Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. But luckily, we're not in the darkness. There is a vibrant working class movement that's worth supporting, and I hope that they get a victory very soon. And it's incredibly encouraging as the Labour Party has tried to do everything to silence working class voices over the past few years, despite all of Corbyn's and many of the people who joined the Labour Party to try to democratize and make that a party for workers. Despite all of their efforts, the powers in the Labour Party have tried to do everything to stifle and silence working people, and that started long before these strikes began. But I'm really happy that workers aren't just sort of sitting around and waiting for a more jovial and friendly Labour Party, and are rather taking the fight into their own hands.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, y'all. Well, we're going to hop over to the post game. I hope y'all join us over there. You can leave us a message at 1940-289-7234, patreon.com/leftreckoning to get access. Next week, we'll be getting our merch out, folks. So keep your eye out for that. And a reminder, we're moving these shows to Tuesday nights, Tuesday at 7 Central. Really looking forward to jumping back on at that time slot. And thanks, Matt. Thanks, Matt Christman. And thanks, everybody, for watching.
Peace.